Okay, so we're now on the 4th episode of Stephen Greer's disclosure project on Gaia. What is this episode called?
The unacknowledged threat, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, in this episode, we pretty much talked about the unacknowledged special ops.
Special access programs.
Special access programs.
Which Stephen Greer gives the acronym USAP, Undisclosed Special Access Project, USAP.
USAP. And this is an acronym that he has made and refers to as these things by. This is not something that's agreed upon in the political lexicon.
I don't think so. Not that I know of.
I just know he was casting aspersions on people making up acronyms in this episode itself. So that's worth asking. I don't know. Maybe USAP is a common term, but it's not something I've come across before.
Well, this episode is full of acronyms. It's full of scary hidden things. We have mass EMP strikes on Iraq. We have people threatening to kill other people if they even learn about a certain government program. We've got the oil industry. We've got the weapons industry. We have the military industrial complex. We have everything in this episode.
This is a very political episode.
It's a very political episode, and it's an episode that, despite it covering a pretty large scope of things, I don't have a lot to say about it. It's a difficult episode to talk about, too, because even though Greer, I feel like we say this every episode, but even though Greer says a lot of things that in theory are kind of compelling to me, they give so little to go off of. There's an entire section in this where he says, there's a guy who used to be military who sent me pictures of his badges, so I believe him. And that's the verification we have.
Yeah, I think once again, there's so much that we are supposed to take on face value from Greer. It's like he'll say something that needs a lot of proof, and that's the context he is giving for the thing that he's allegedly affording some modicum of proof for. But it's sort of like, well, back up. Can we first prove the context that you're giving us before we even get to the secondary thing that you're calling proof? That's what I felt like this episode was a lot of.
Do you remember the part of this episode? Actually, you paused it when we were watching to rewind and watch it again. They bring up a document, I think that had to do with Ben Rich, the Lockheed Skunk Works guy. And they're like, here's this document that Steve Greer has. It literally flashes on the screen for a split second.
Yes.
And then it's gone.
Yes.
That's like a very good metaphor for how this episode plays out.
Because I got to that part and I rewinded it because I wanted to pause the letter at that portion, but I couldn't. It flashed on the screen so quickly that even on pausing it, it was useless.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question, and I think I'm going to structure my part of this conversation by asking you some questions and see how you answer them.
Okay.
Do you believe that there are black budget programs working on or studying alien technology propulsion systems?
I think that's an excellent question to kick this off with because we didn't exactly define what Greer is talking about in the USAP. Or with the acronym USAP, but that's the definition. It's that these black budget programs. And I think this goes back to what you were saying in the discussion of the last episode of the series, which is he'll often begin a point with something that people can, by and large, probably agree with. And from that very generalized, agreeable portion, he'll go on to make a big leap or claim about something much, much, much more specific. So to answer your question, I think it's pretty reasonable with the evidence we have of the United States government not being able to account for their entire budget. I'm sure there are a lot of reasons why that is the case, but it wouldn't be surprising to me if some of those are special programs that are hidden. So is it knowable to me? No, I'm just a regular civilian.
Mm-hmm.
But that's something that I don't think would be surprising.
This actually taps into one of my, I'd say, biggest fascinations with alien stuff. And it's something we talked about when we really first started thinking about these sorts of things. And what I kind of wonder sometimes is like me, you, anyone on UFO Twitter, anyone not with the right level of clearance, if it's literally impossible for us to know even a morsel of the truth.
Yes.
Because we have civilian level clearance. Mm-hmm. We have nothing above that. And I feel like, especially in America, with how, secretive the government can be about things. And I'm not even saying that in like a conspiracy way. I just mean literally information clearance. Maybe it's really impossible, for us to ever glean anything.
Yeah, and I think that's why when it comes to this type of information, I think my interest is more of performing a rhetorical analysis on the evidence and the way it's presented, rather than getting too terribly bogged down in the evidence itself. Because for one, as we previously discussed, I think there are other people doing it better than we can, or the purview of our interest is in digging into finding out that evidence. Not that we don't want to do some, not that that isn't valuable to dive into, but it seems much more worthwhile to me when you're addressing a topic that by and large seems like it's going to be unknowable, to just talk about the presentation of that information itself.
Right. And that's kind of where there's an interesting crossroad here, because I also agree with you in the sense that I believe that there are projects in the government sapping up a good amount of money that maybe a lot of people don't know what they're doing.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that all or the majority of I believe the statistic quoted by Greer is $8 to $20 trillion. He says over a period of decades. We're not even given necessarily how many decades, but $8 to $20 trillion unaccounted for. We don't know where that is going, but that doesn't speak anything to whether or not this is going to alien or alien technology specific projects or untold. Mm-hmm. I mean, the government is maniacal in all kinds of ways. So some of it alien, sure, maybe. Most of it other stuff, probably.
And that's also why this episode in a way was disappointing for me, because it's like, I understand maybe Greer can't literally sit down. We've said this many times, but with all these documents and like prove it all to me. Mm-hmm. But this is one of those episodes where I am following him in the sense that like, man, I wish we knew kind of like what was cooking up in the government. It is interesting how some presidents seem to know more than others. He alludes to something, and he never quite goes into detail about this, but he says it was Eisenhower who lost control of the information war, basically, inside the government.
This is specifically when I said that sometimes he says something general and then moves to a more specific thing that he leaves totally unproven, totally without context, but we're supposed to take at face value because he's already sort of established a general thing that we can agree with. So he said that Eisenhower lost control of these special programs at the beginning of the episode and kind of drops it. So I was like, why did Eisenhower lose control? What does it mean that he lost control? I thought you were saying that they weren't even aware of these programs. So how could he lose control and why? Well, then 10 or 15 minutes later in the episode, he says Eisenhower lost control because he wanted peaceful contact with extraterrestrials.
I forgot about that.
Okay, well now that totally is reframing what my brain is, what my brain is using to contextualize this whole Eisenhower thing. Because before you told me it was because he wanted to make peaceful contact with extraterrestrials, I thought this was some sort of internal political problem,
which would kind of make sense.
Right.
Eventually, because Eisenhower was president when in like the late 50s, I think. So it's like that makes sense to me that there would have been a president in the post World War II era. Eventually, it's going to be somebody who's going to lose control of what's going on the intelligence side of things. It's bound to happen. But yeah, then later in the episode, he's like, well, it was really because
he wanted to make peaceful contact with ETs,
Yeah.
and then that is not investigated anymore. Can you give me some evidence for Eisenhower wanting to make this peaceful contact with the ETs? No, we go from one thing to another thing. This proves this, but we don't even have any proof for the central connecting piece of evidence. Like, can we slow down and talk about why Eisenhower thought, or we have evidence to believe that he wanted to make peaceful contact with ETs? No, that's totally aborted.
I'll tell you what the evidence is. Do you want to know?
I would love to know.
How many times across alien movies have you had to hear this same clip of this same Eisenhower speech over and over and over and over? We must be careful of the military-industrial complex, which is a sentiment I agree with to my grave. I agree with that. But that clip to me is approaching the point of parody, where I think anyone making a documentary about aliens, anyone making a documentary about any conspiracy, that clip is going to play at some point. And people are going to be like, this was the moment. They extrapolate so much from that speech. We don't even know if he wrote that speech. It could have been written by anybody. And I'm approaching the point now where when I first saw the recording of that Eisenhower speech, I was like, wow, like, that's so cool for a president to have said that on TV. A president who lived through World War II, who's seen probably was alive during World War I, I assume. Ike was pretty old when he was president. And so it's like, wow, that's so interesting. It's to the point now for me where I can barely take that speech seriously anymore, because it plays all the time in all these Greer movies and all over the fucking place.
And like you said, is so malleable to other types
whatever you want
of conspiracy theories. And I think that's what we find, is that Greer's rhetoric aligns with all kinds of conspiracy claims and theories, but when it comes down to the specific evidence of the individual stories he's telling, we just totally hopscotch right over it. I think this episode once again goes back to Greer having a messiah complex. For one, in the description of the episode, it refers to him as the founding father of UFO disclosure, which once again echoes the sentiment of the loneliest job in the world that we run into in Unacknowledged itself. We also return to... He said specifically, we have the solutions to all these problems. And in this instance, in this episode, he's referring specifically to the environmental crisis. He says that they're in these unacknowledged programs that people are using lethal force to keep covered up. And then Billy chimes in and just says that we've just got to wake up and release this information to the general population. Well, first of all, Billy, who are you talking to in this particular?
This was Billy's worst episode.
Yeah, it was a pretty bad one. But it's like, are you talking to us, the viewer? Because I have, and I think most people with a Gaia subscription don't actually have much control in this particular avenue of the world.
Yeah. And anyone with a Gaia subscription has already woken up.
Gaia prescription, please, doctor, get me on the Gaia.
I want to talk about your mention of lethal force in this episode. So there's a quote very early on where Dr. Stephen Greer, actually, quick tangent. Do you recall the part where Dr. Stephen Greer is talking about his phone being tapped?
Yes.
So there is a part of this episode where Stephen Greer, he says he's on the phone and he can hear many people speaking many different languages in the background of the phone call, which, just going to say again, maybe mental health alert, but we'll leave that for now. And he goes, "Who is this? Who am I speaking to?" And someone says, "Oh no, it's Mr. Greer." And he goes, "That's Dr. Stephen Greer to you." I just...
He has the presence of mind during he's caught them tapping his phone in the act. Not one group of people, but apparently all the languages.
He said up in a satellite. I didn't really know what that meant. Anyway, that was a great little anecdote. Quite haughty coming from a country doctor wearing jeans on set, which I also think is a deliberate choice. Anyway, back to the lethal force thing. There's a quote early on in this episode where I don't remember who he was talking about, but it was someone who said, I was in the military, I got taken down underground, and we all had to let up our weapons and empty our pockets. And someone came up to this individual and said, see this bullet? This has your name on it if you say anything about what you saw down here. And that establishes a pattern throughout this episode that happens multiple times, which reminds me of the opening quote of Unacknowledged, where Stephen Greer says, my biggest regret is that no one has been as brave as me, essentially. Mm-hmm. A lot of times in this episode, Stephen says, here's this great thing we could have learned about, but this military guy didn't want to lose his star. This military guy didn't want to get demoted. And it's like, man, all of this is anecdotal from you. You had the letter from John Peterson, which you misrepresented. You don't have letters from any of these people. The one letter you have crossfades off the screen so quickly we can't even read it.
And I think this is a big reason of why this particular episode is so difficult to talk about, which is going back to what you said or how you open this, which is we're never going to get to know this stuff because we are civilians. And the stuff that we could know, which is to say perhaps documents that have fallen into his hands, testimonials by people that are in the government, things like that, things that wouldn't necessarily prove it without any degree of doubt, but would speak to there being some tangible substance behind the claims, isn't in this episode, isn't presented by Greer.
Yeah.
And as just civilians, we will never have access to this.
Greer does do something, though, that I took note of, and I think it's his attempt at doing what you just said, which is like, how does he still make a case for these things? And I noticed this was the first time I've ever really heard him say, I don't remember the full quote, but he says something along the lines of, it's not everyone in the CIA who does this. It's not everyone in the military. It's not everyone in the government. It's only this very small amount of black budget people. And I kind of feel like that's Greer's way of covering his own ass to be like, okay, I don't have all the declassified documents right in front of me, but I'm not saying the whole government's bad. Like, I kind of saw that as a rhetorical strategy, almost giving himself some credence, which is like, I'm not a kookster who's saying it's corrupt from top to bottom. Listen to me. I'm Dr. Stephen Greer. I'm saying it's not the whole CIA. It's just a little bit of the CIA. Like, I kind of felt like that quote was a way to make up for the fact that he didn't have much evidence at all.
Yeah. And then following that, Billy says some question that's like, so how does it all work? How do these special dark programs function? And with no evidence, he just goes on to say that it's that small group of people, not only in the United States, although we are the hub because we've got the best technological innovations or something like that. But it's not just the United States. It's a small group of people here and in China and all of these other countries, and they're little cells, and all these cells are connected. And with zero evidence, that just sounds like kooky. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but without the presentation of any substance behind it, and Billy's just like, hey, explain it for us. It just sounds like someone saying, oh, it could be this.
Speaking of the government, there's two government interactions Greer points out in this episode. I just wanted to bring up so that we acknowledge that they happen, so they don't go unacknowledged, if you will. The first one is that I kind of saw this as a shot at the CIA director Woolsey, who we talked about last time, where Greer's kind of just talking about something, and he's saying, here's all the government people who didn't know, and here's who did. And he's like, oh, Woolsey didn't know anything. And I kind of just saw that as a subtle little jab, reinforcing his narrative that it was like him who briefed Woolsey on this thing. Woolsey factors into this episode not a single additional time after that. It's just Greer offhandedly is like, by the way, Woolsey knew nothing about this. I just thought that was kind of funny. There's also something Greer said, and this was a part of the episode where he was speaking with someone who worked in the Pentagon, which, man, the Pentagon, every time I see like videos of it, it scares me. But he's talking to someone who works in the Pentagon about, I think, recovering some info about aliens or something. And tell me what you think this sentence means. Greer says he had a stand-up formal briefing. So I don't know what that means. A stand-up formal briefing in the Admiral's office.
I guess opposed to a dinner party.
As opposed to a dinner party. So he has a stand-up formal briefing in the Admiral's office, but then right after Admiral's office, he says, conference room. So this is the full sentence, and I wrote every word down from the episode. I had a stand-up formal briefing in the Admiral's office conference room. What does that mean? I feel like he just said everything he could possibly say.
Yeah, I mean, I would love just someone, not me, I don't have it in me, to go through Stephen Greer's sentences and diagram them. Because either he means that person had a conference room inside of his office.
Right.
Like his office was large enough that there's then a conference room off to the side, which...
Or maybe it's like the greater office, like the Admiral's office, like an office, like all the rooms?
Yeah.
But then that makes me wonder, if it was a formal briefing, what's a stand-up formal briefing? Well, like, what is this? I'm basically just pointing out this quote to be like, I think Greer will say anything just to get you to believe him that extra inch. If you're someone listening to that sentence and you don't know all the jargon, you're like, well... That was a stand-up formal briefing.
For sure. And I think that's what we're definitely seeing with Greer, is that if you look at the individual components of the sentences, they don't always make a whole lot of sense. But when you see them delivered from him confidently, relaxed, he's saying things that sound smart.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why if you don't stop and really pay attention, it sounds reasonable, but then when you take a microscope to it, it's just word salad. Like they often don't correspond with each other.
However, speaking of taking a microscope to something, I do have to say, even if this episode didn't, show us documents or anything, which at this point with Greer we know we're never going to get, this episode did give us a lot of names. Photographs of men in the military, the photograph of the Admiral, who he had the stand-up formal briefing in the office conference room, another guy who that Admiral contacted to ask if he could look at the alien bodies, and the guy's response was, dude, don't ever ask me that shit again or we're all going to get in trouble. Did these things happen? I don't know. But the names of the people were in this episode. So, there's a part of me that when I was watching this episode, I did think to myself, maybe one of these days I've got to go get a big cup of coffee, go on Stephen Greer's stupid website, and try to just listen to as many interviews as I can.
Yes.
Because those do exist. And as much shit as I can give Stephen Greer, I haven't dug into to the archives. And that's still something I think I need to do.
Yeah, I would love that too. I mean, one of the names that I wrote down was Carl Wolf, who he was saying was the moon disclosure guy. And when it comes to alien stuff, when I hear stuff about moon bases, that's where I feel pretty shaky. But I got a name. I have a claim about the moon bases. I'm gonna look into it. Maybe Carl Wolf is going to be the person.
Well, Carl Wolf is in Unacknowledged.
Oh, I don't remember him.
Wait, he might be in The Phenomenon.
The Phenomenon?
Do you remember the moon base part of The Phenomenon? I don't know if we'll cut this or not, but do you remember the moon base part of The Phenomenon? And he's talking about looking at the moon and they see a base on it, and he's like, I can't believe I just saw that. No, this can't get out.
That's Carl Wolf?
I think that's Carl Wolf.
Okay.
Off the top of my head, I think that's Carl Wolf. Which I gotta say, I've only seen The Phenomenon, I would say 1.5 times. I've seen it one complete time and some other times sporadically. It's gonna be very, very interesting to revisit that film on the Secret Knowledge YouTube channel and podcast, which you can check out when we eventually do it. But it'll be very interesting to revisit that film and see if like a name pops up that we just know as some Greer grifter,
Mhm.
right? Like, because that was such a well-made movie.
For sure.
But is it just full of weirdos? I don't know.
And that's
It would be heartbreaking if so.
Yeah, because my memory of the phenomenon, especially as opposed to unacknowledged, is that it's much more put together, much more focused, has a real continuum of the way evidence is presented, that you feel connected to all of the ideas sequentially. So, but what I've also learned from basically anything that we've looked into is that stuff can fall apart pretty quickly.
Zimbabwe Children. I gotta know about those Zimbabwe Children.
Yeah, so the Zimbabwe Children, which I don't know if we should explain this, but a very brief summary of what the Zimbabwe Children was. There was a school in Zimbabwe allegedly visited by UFOs, and even now the adult children are very confident about what they saw, and even as adults maintain their stories. And there's a number of children that say this. It's not just one report. And I think there's also a teacher that says so as well.
There's a teacher who says she regrets having not let the children speak, or not believing the children or something, and years later. Or maybe that was the Australian. I can't remember. But there's a few schools.
No, you're talking that was the headmistress or whatnot of the Zimbabwe. I remember specifically. What I am starting to feel about the Zimbabwe story, because I find that to be one of the most compelling experiencer stories that exists, is I know those children were interviewed by a famous psychologist who I believe also taught at Harvard and almost got expelled from being a professor at that school because he was making some pretty fantastic claims about aliens and UFOs, because he was hypnotizing and interviewing a number of experiencers.
So he was hypnotizing them?
I think he hypnotized the children.
The Zimbabwe children?
I think he did. That's something we're going to have to look into more.
Yeah.
I think he did, but I know he hypnotized a lot of the adult experiencers that he encountered. Actually, when I told you I was in Texas and in a motel and watching what seemed to be a pretty quality alien UFO documentary on Showtime, this was the documentary that I was watching.
Really?
Yeah. So I love the Zimbabwe children's story. I still think it is compelling. I feel like that's the first crack getting in to the story. And I'm not saying I've even researched that psychologist enough to have a for sure. I'm not for sure about the psychologist in the way that I'm pretty for certain about Steve Greer, that there's some pretty clearly grifty components to his personality, the way he presents evidence, and what seem to be the motivations for his personal life and personal projects. So I'm not there as far as the psychologist goes, but when experiencer stories have a strong hypnotic component to them, it's going to make me feel a little less confident about them. And now knowing that psychologist is connected to the Zimbabwe children, it makes me think, okay, I need to learn more about this before I can just run to my friends and say, no, there are children in Zimbabwe. They saw the spacecraft.
Yeah.
It waved at them.
Well, it's in the same way when I think there's two, we could maybe call them experience Steve Greer moments where he's in and out of sleep as they're occurring. So I don't know. That's definitely a crack. I've got a conspiracy for you. And this could be off the wall, but if Steven's allowed to do it, I think I'm allowed to do it. So, the Tic Tac spaceship, Steve Greer says, not aliens, that's Lockheed Skunk Works or something. That was their latest ARV, Alien Reproduction Vehicle. Is it possible that Steve Greer himself is a disinformation agent?
That's a great question. And given with how closely he associated with Doty in
Right.
Unacknowledged and in some of his other documentaries, that but would the government allow for someone to make so much personal profit off of this? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I was going to say the one crack in this theory is that Stephen Greer seems to be pulling for money literally at every possible opportunity. When we signed on to Gaia today, we saw... so Gaia is what, $10.99 a month?
I can't remember. It's not exorbitantly expensive, but it's something like that.
But isn't Netflix $7?
I don't remember.
I don't know anymore. Yeah. I don't have any streaming, or at least that I pay for, so I don't know the prices. I thought $10 was kind of expensive for Gaia. You're able to log on.
Well, it definitely. So I'm pretty sure Netflix is something around like $15-$16.
Oh, really?
Right now, yeah. Okay. It's gradually increased over the years. But the difference between Gaia versus Netflix is you're getting significantly more content on Netflix versus Gaia. So you could still say that that's relatively expensive, which maybe you could argue away Gaia is a more specific topic. We could say that means that they need more money per video or watch or whatever than Netflix does.
Yeah. Well, when we logged on to Gaia today, we saw that you can upgrade your Gaia subscription for more Stephen Greer content.
You can hear the Q&As.
So Stephen Greer isn't just behind one paywall. He's behind
multiple paywalls. Yeah.
And I recently saw again the other day, actually just now, I think today's Sunday, so the retreat should be ending. A CE5 or CSETI retreat just happened, and you could pay to watch the live stream, which I think if I hadn't been in Branson last night, I might have done. And there was another instance where there's this huge 30% figure. And again, our internet brains think that's 30% off. But once again, it's just an option to funnel 30% of your payment into additional Stephen Greer funds, which is just so funny to me. So to your question, does Stephen Greer profiting so much put a hole in that theory? I think so, yes. I was mostly just saying it to be funny. But I think it's a fine theory. I don't think the fact that he's profiting off of it means that it's impossible. I've often wondered if that's his bent into this information just because what he says sounds so unreasonable so much of the time that it seems like it would have to be disinformation. But right. I think he might just be a megalomaniac and either unwilling or incapable of seeing how fragilely his ideas are actually connected. Right. My main thing that made me think that, or at least think Stephen Greer is like so all about like anything you've seen on TV that even looks like a UFO spaceship. I have proof that that's just experimental technology from such and such company. And if that's true, like beside any interview he has, beside any claim he makes about aliens, that is the one thing I would want to know more about, because he gets into that in the cosmic hoax shit quite a bit, where he actually pulls out a little replica weird triangle thing, and he's like, this is more what a spaceship looks like. And it's like, what do you mean? Where did you get that? Did you make that? Where did that come from? Like, what is this, and where did you get this information? So that's kind of the direction where my interest is going with Stephen Greer, is he discounts every single UFO, UAP, whatever, other than his stupid pictures on his website that look like heat
If it
maps.
doesn't come from Greer, it's bad information.
Yeah. So
I would love to hear him talk about Bob Lazar and what he thinks of Bob Lazar's information.
Because Bob does, I mean, his big thing is the propulsion system, the anti-gravity propulsion thing, and that's what Stephen Greer says the government's doing, is working on propulsion.
So are they on the same side, or are they on different sides? Because if one of the two of those people is more likely to be a disinformation agent, I think it's probably Bob Lazar rather than Stephen Greer.
Too. I will say, if Jeremy Corbell and Stephen Greer ever team up, I don't think I'll be able to watch it.
No, that would be totally unpalatable. But it would be impossible because Stephen Greer would not be able to handle how often Jeremy Corbell interrupts him.
Those two on a 3-hour Joe Rogan podcast would be fucking insane.
That's instantaneous headache. I gotta. Will you hit the lights? I can't see now.
Well, is there anything else you want to say about this episode?
I don't think there is.
I don't think there's anything I want to say either. Gordon Cooper makes an appearance. Okay, that's actually my last thing. I was a little interested to hear that Steve and Gordon Cooper had teamed up briefly to brief a think tank. I don't know what that's about. I don't really have anything to say about it. I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing. He's like, yeah, I'm in the 90s. Me and Gordon Cooper briefed a think tank on aliens, and then I think they ended up losing the footage because they gave it to some military person, and then they threw it.
Yes, I remember this theory. Okay, so I don't think, to my memory, that Greer ever saw or had the footage, but Gordon Cooper claims to have had footage of a craft on film, but it was
confiscated.
Yes, from him. But the briefing is new. Yeah. I mean, but everything's a briefing. I'm so tired of the word briefing.
Everything from Greer is a briefing. Yeah. I wonder if he wears boxers or briefs.
Boxers or briefings.
Well, I think that concludes then our thoughts on this 4th episode of Disclosure with Dr. Stephen Greer. It'll be interesting to see what we have to say as the additional episodes as we watch, the rest of what's in the catalog.
I did appreciate that this episode was focused on at least a central topic. I think the evidence in it was once again bad, which is to say there wasn't much evidence or proof laid out. But I did appreciate the focus.
I also appreciated the focus, despite even being pretty unfocused focus. So we now have 5 more episodes to go with this Gaia series. We're also cooking up some other things right now, so keep your eye on the channel. We're hoping maybe by the time this episode is out on YouTube that we have audio episodes available, something we're cooking up on podcast platforms. So just keep your eyes peeled for those things. And in the meantime, give this video a like or a dislike if you're a disinformation agent. And don't forget to subscribe as well, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Bye.